Hey everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So today we're going to be talking about horror. It is the week of Halloween, so it seemed like the perfect time to be talking about the spookiest, creepiest, scariest genre, horror. Horror is a genre meant to scare, shock, startle, or even repulse the reader. So horror is all about the emotional reaction that it elicits. It's about creating those feelings of fear or horror. Horror tends to veer a bit on the shorter side. You'll see a lot of horror novels as short as 40,000 words, going up to around 80,000. There is, of course, longer horror, but in general, it's a genre that trends a little bit shorter. So if you're working on a horror novel, especially as a debut horror novelist, it's good if you can keep it on the shorter end of the word count. There are tons of different subgenres of horror, but a couple of popular ones include slasher, cosmic horror, comedy horror, folk horror, supernatural horror, gothic horror, zombies, fantasy or sci-fi horror, and psychological horror. So let's talk about some tips for writing in this genre. Like I said earlier, horror isn't about including certain elements of story. It's about creating an emotional reaction in the reader. It's a very intense genre in that way. For me, horror movies are often the most memorable movies for me to watch. I remember them and they stick with me more than movies in other genres. And it's because they're just more intense to watch. They really create a strong emotional reaction in you. And that emotional reaction doesn't always necessarily have to just be fear. As a horror author, when you put a reader in that really heightened emotional state that comes from such a terrifying or creepy or scary scenario, can make all the other emotions of the piece that much more heightened as well. So the first tip is to tap into common fears. Now, of course, the fear factor in horror is key. People don't usually read horror for just a nice, relaxing, escapist read. People read horror because they want to feel afraid or disturbed. And part of that means creating situations that tap into the reader's own fears. Sometimes this makes use of instinctual fears that people have, like heights or spiders. Or it can be uncanny, supernatural elements, different kinds of monsters, ghouls, demons. The thing about horror is that it doesn't just show us fear on the page, it ideally brings it to life. So the reader isn't watching a character feel afraid, they feel afraid themselves. But this often means doing something unexpected. So for example, spiders are a very common fear. That might mean creating a monster that has kind of an arachnid quality, but is still unique to your story. Or you might create a monster or a ghost that's a metaphor so that that ghoul or that monster has an added relevance to it. It's not just scary, it's also representative of something real. That's why social thrillers or social horror is such a growing and popular subset of horror. Like how Get Out was about racism in modern America, or The Babadook was about grief and mental health in single mothers. Part of why the horror aspects of these movies is so impactful is that they served as a vehicle and a metaphor for something real. So they had such an added relevance and impact. Step number 2 is to strike the right atmosphere. Horror is an immersive genre meant to draw in the reader so they feel like they're a part of the scenario and feel those emotions themselves. And creating a really atmospheric setting, an atmosphere is so key for that. That's also one reason why I tend to like a lot of horror movies, is because I find that they're often the most atmospheric. Now, there is no single horror atmosphere. When we think of horror, we think of spooky, abandoned buildings with cobwebs and bats, and you can play into those kinds of ideas and imagery. But the important thing with horror is just that there's a strong atmosphere and that it's immersive. The more immersed the reader is in a story, the more they forget that they're reading a story, and the more they feel that it's real and they'll experience all these emotions themselves. That's why striking a really strong mood is so important. Start by picking a setting with an atmospheric, immersive quality. Use strong, vivid imagery to depict your setting. And make use of gross or terrifying or creepy imagery. You might use similes that are a little disgusting. So for example, you could say that the bark on a tree looks like the rotten skin of a corpse. That's pretty disgusting. But in horror, it really does strike the atmosphere and could make just a forest seem like a really creepy, haunting place. One thing that I find very helpful when creating atmosphere is to make use of color. Think about the color palette of your story and bring it to life by describing everything within that color palette. The color of the sky, the nature, the trees, the buildings, wherever it is that it's set. A lot of horror tends to have a darker color palette, and so by really weaving that into your work, you can create a really strong sense of atmosphere. Oftentimes, because that's where our fears are most rooted. As children, we often experience the most fear at night when the world looks a little distorted. As a kid, you see a shadow from a tree outside on the wall and you might think it's a monster. So many kids are afraid of the dark. That's why so much horror is set at night, because first of all, we associate it with fear from our childhood, and that's very hard to shake even if we're not scared of the dark anymore. And also because night has this way of distorting things and making them even more scary. We can also play with that in a fun, subversive way. One of the most successful horror films of the past few years was Midsummer, which really subverted the typical look of a horror film by being set almost entirely during the day with very bright, cheery, summery imagery. It actually really highlighted the horror because it was this weird juxtaposition that we're not used to. However, despite the unconventional setting for a horror movie, it was very atmospheric, and that's the important thing, no matter what setting you pick to make it really immersive. Number 3 is to raise the stakes. Horror is in general an extremely high stakes genre. In order to really make the reader feel gripped and afraid, the stakes need to be really high. Survival is often the basic stake in a horror movie. The most fundamental goal in a lot of horror is that the main character wants to make it out alive. But there are a few ways that you can raise the stakes even beyond this, such as having the character need to protect loved ones. The more lives that are on the line and the more the reader is invested in the bonds between these characters, the stakes go up higher and higher. Or there may be a mystery that needs to be solved in order to stop the threat for good. This can range from figuring out the identity of the killer or unraveling ancient secrets about the universe in order to stop the demonic entity. But this can really raise the stakes because they're not just trying to get out alive, they're trying to stop this from happening again. In general though, straightforward stakes usually are most effective in horror. While you can have underlying layers of interpersonal tension and interpersonal stakes that can add a lot of nuance, it is important to have those straightforward stakes like survival that the reader can really clearly understand, really clearly invest in, and that will feel extremely high. Step number 4 is to pick your point of view. Drawing the reader into the story means creating a point of view character whose perspective the reader can really immerse in. In horror, you typically avoid third-person omniscient because that can really lessen the mystery by giving you access to every point of view. In horror, you usually want a narrower scope that feels more claustrophobic and leaves more to the imagination and creates more of a mystery. So most horror is going to be written in either first person or third person limited. First person can be very chilling as it allows the main character to directly tell us the events. In present tense, it keeps us the suspense that they may not survive until the end of the story. And in past tense, it allows them to recall and unravel the story as they relive it. However, a lot of horror also makes use of third person limited. This allows for a little more control in the psychic distance, so you can zoom out a bit from the character in order to create maybe more mystery, and can allow for maybe very atmospheric descriptions that might be a little out of voice in a first-person narrative. A lot of horror also makes use of unreliable narrators. We've got an entire video on unreliable narrators, so we'll leave that for you to check out. Step 5, to plot twist or not to plot twist. Plot twists can be extremely impactful and memorable, but are notoriously difficult to pull off. We do have an entire video on plot twists, so I'll leave a link to that if you want to check that out. If a plot twist is too obvious or too underwhelming, it can drag down an otherwise very effective horror novel. The thing is, many twists in horror are so bold that they can by now be easily predicted. For example, the victim or the protagonist is really the killer. Someone we thought was dead is actually alive. Or it was all in their head. These kinds of twists were probably super effective the first time they were used, but by now, it's really hard to make them land. However, smaller, subtler twists can still be downright chilling. A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner is known for its very subtle but kind of horrifying twist, where after the title character's death, the entire town is investigating, and in their home they find the body of a man who went missing years ago decaying on her bed, and one of her silver hairs on the pillow next to him. On the other hand, you may also choose not to have a plot twist. Not all horror needs a plot twist. If you're thinking too hard about having one and you only want to have a plot twist for the sake of it, it may not be a natural part of the story. The ending doesn't need to completely turn the tables to be effective. As long as there's a strong buildup of suspense and an exciting conclusion that makes use of that suspense, you don't need a plot twist. Step number 6, remember the basics. Horror makes use of all the same basic storytelling elements that all genres make use of. Strong characters, strong prose, strong plot and structure, interesting conflict and stakes, and clever use of symbol, metaphor, or theme. These things transcend genre. Executing a horror novel well isn't just about executing the horror well, but having an overall well-written story, like in any genre. If you're stuck on concepts, try to answer these basic questions. What fear or struggle does the protagonist need to overcome? What active decisions will the main character make? How will they defeat or escape their adversary, if at all? And what are the ultimate consequences of their actions and choices at the end of the story? These are really basic questions, but if you can answer them all, they'll give you a really strong basis for a horror novel, allowing you to then hone the suspense with a strong base concept. Step number 7, create emotional contrast and texture. Good horror is not just terrifying all the way through, rather uses contrasting emotions to really highlight the most terrifying moments. Moments of joy, love, peace, contentment, humor, and just overall humanity. Create rounded characters with complex emotions and lives, and therefore the stakes will feel much higher for those characters because we've seen them in their happiest moments and we know what there is to lose. You'll find a lot of horror actually has moments of humor throughout, often maybe darker humor, that can really allow the horror to shine. Horror is pretty much never terrifying from the first sentence until the very last. Instead, it flows through a range of different emotional states, escalating towards the most horrifying moment at the story's climax. And it's that emotional contrast and emotional texture that really gives the fear its greatest impact. And finally, step number 8 is look for something new. You can still fall back on popular tropes or trends in horror, but see if you can put your own spin on it. You can definitely still pay homage to your favorite horror tropes, but try to make them your own. We've actually got an entire video on subverting tropes and making them your own, so I'll leave a link to that. It's probably impossible to completely reinvent the wheel in every single piece of horror that you write, but you don't want to just recycle what's already been done. Ask yourself what you can bring to the table that's new, maybe based on your own skills, your own experiences, or just your own ideas in order to create something really original. So that is how to write horror. In the next video, we're going to be talking about some tropes in horror. Till then, I would love to know what your favorite horror novels or movies are in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing videos every week.